Welcome to KU Padashala. My name is Chad A. Haag. I am an author and former teacher from the United States of America. I'm very excited today to have the opportunity to discuss existentialist philosophy with you in this fourth lecture in our series on the history of Western philosophy. Specifically, today we'll be examining Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. It might seem strange to begin with Dostoevsky, who was, after all, a novelist rather than a philosopher in the traditional sense of the term. I think this is in line with existentialism's general aversion to the kind of philosophy done within the academy, especially in the 19th century, when philosophy claimed to have reached the status of providing a systematic account to explain away even human individuality itself as nothing more than a passing moment on notion's way to absolute knowing. This a reduction of human individuality to nothing more than the status of an empty epiphenomenon of lower impersonal processes was a defining theme of existentialism. Even the case of Dostoevsky, who mainly communicated his ideas through stories. In Notes from the Underground, for example, he asked the very serious question: if one was able to live underground in an apartment without ever leaving after one had, for example, received an inheritance from a deceased family member, if one could stay down there without ever going out, would doing nothing there make one into nobody? Well, in lockdown, we basically all had the chance to try this out for ourselves. A great lockdown of 2020, this idea that was before merely hypothetical was something that all of us got to experience firsthand. Just as the character in the novella reacted to this nothingness by simply consuming lots of, in his case, like literature to just pass the time. Similarly, most people, I think, reacted to being stuck in lockdown by just consuming one Netflix series after another. But this was perhaps only to put off the difficult question of asking, now that one was forced to, with no other distractions, who exactly one was in the first place. The paradox of the Notes from the Underground is that it is precisely when that man leaves the underground to go out into the world that he really fails to be anybody and to do anything. However, the footnote within the book explicitly warns against trying to psychoanalyze the narrator as one person who's just particularly troubled or crazy or messed up in some other way, for he tells us that this purely imaginary story is actually about all of us. The speaker in this story, who is nobody, simply is the nobody that all of us really are. The Notes from the Underground has a very strange structure, therefore, in which the first section is a long philosophical rant, while the second is an episode containing a painful memory from his past, which, ironically enough, became much more painful, precisely in its contemplation as a memory than it had been when he actually experienced it as a real event. At any rate, the first section largely rants against the scientific reductivism that was seeming to provide the ultimate answer for how humans work in the 19th century, as science was making so much progress, in which case the author warned that he'd rather be wrong but free than have this sort of scientific truth and lose that freedom. One famous passage, he notes that he'd rather assert 2 + 2 = 5 and at least have the freedom to be wrong than to have that freedom automated away on technological grounds, as we are all too close to reaching that point as I speak. It's interesting, though, that the author reflects on his past before he was in the underground all the time, when he was working a job and seeming to be the career title that society attributed to him, and noting that even that was just an empty appearance. It's not that he didn't know how to be that particular identity, it's rather that he didn't know how to be anything at all. And in fact, it's only a fool who could be deceived to think that he is the title that society has given him. For anyone who really understands what's going on there will realize that that is simply an empty appearance. In other words, the institutions and values which people take for granted aren't really enough to give you the answer to who you are. You have to seize the freedom to create your own meaning, knowing full well the groundlessness of your own decision to do so. In a certain sense, then, consciousness within existentialism is definitely not a sign of evolution from lower life forms to higher ones. We move from the seemingly unconscious plants to semi-conscious animals to fully conscious humans. That may be the case, but that is not a sign of an improvement, for you only you only arrive at an illness which makes the entity function less efficiently as a result of being conscious. He warns, though, that even if a mathematical solution could be worked out to end suffering, one would be misled to think that there's a single cause for it. He argues that even if there was some economic system which provided for everybody's needs without them having to actually worry about it, if all the food, shelter, and water you needed was simply given to you, some propose that that would lead to a total elimination of all crime or misbehavior, because after all, people only do bad things because of economic motivations. He argues, though, that even if one did not have a reason to feel this spite, simply because of the illness of consciousness, one still would. By the 20th century, Albert Camus' The Stranger provided the meditation of a man who committed a terrible murder and spent the entire novel being questioned, okay, why did you do it? There must have been some cause. When he responds that there was none, that enrages the public even more than the crime itself had. Yet the unreliability of rationalism to solve all of one's problems of consciousness, something which Dostoevsky did not express skepticism for only on an individual level, for he noted in his lengthy novel The Possessed that suddenly being exposed to centuries worth of Western rationalism, as Russia was all at once in the 19th century, actually did not make them any more free. It only led to their self-destruction. The possessed reference within the title, or the demons referenced in another translation of the title, are actually just the demon of nihilism and the nation of Russia itself, which is possessed by it. Ironically enough, precisely through going beyond the groundless, archaic social system which it was still stuck in the 19th century, in contrast with the Enlightenment Western European nations. Things like the monarchy, the serfs that were basically slaves tied to the land rather than democratic subjects, the orthodox religious traditions which were literally preserving ways of doing things from the 8th century, in contrast with the Reformation of Christianity in the Protestant nations, and even the kind of Reformation you had in Roman Catholicism. It was all of these things which led people to say that Russia was stuck in the Middle Ages, which, ironically enough, when you realize the groundlessness of them, you actually then find your own self-destruction by the demon of nihilism which possessed Russia, like the set of pigs in the Gospel of Luke who were only driven to run off a cliff after that had happened. By Kierkegaard, we have a more explicitly philosophical meditation on the problem of existentialism by contrasting the existential subject with the objective knower of, say, Cartesianism or the scientific method, whereas the latter would be a neutral subject who would simply interpret data as it manifests itself. The existential subject can't really have that neutrality because it is always situated in some mood which conditions how things will appear to it. We're stuck in the mood of anxiety, despair, dread, boredom, etc. And this is uniquely a problem for consciousness. Rocks and chairs don't suffer from anxiety precisely because they don't have to become anything. They already are exactly what they are. The human subject, in contrast, has to constantly become without having any predetermined idea of what he or she is supposed to be becoming. The existentialist formula that existence precedes essence, that is to say, you have to already be existing before you know what you're supposed to be, is something which from the start already lands you in something like a state of despair, so you really do not have the choice to just not think about this predicament. There are, however, a few different ways that one could take, different paths to deal with this, and Kierkegaard actually ordered them hierarchically, starting with the aesthetic stage. In the aesthetic stage, one reacts to this predicament of being in despair, ultimately the realization that one is inevitably going to die and nobody else can die for me, by taking the naive route of simply seeking out pleasure for the self. The problem, of course, is that no matter how intense any given experience of pleasure might be, it is bound to be temporary, and once it is over, you will be stuck in the infinite loop of having to repeat it over and over again. Eventually, the person stuck in this stage realizes, as the seducer's diary recounted within Either Or by Kierkegaard, that one actually has a perverse incentive to draw out the procedure of seeking out that pleasure as long as possible, because the moment the seducer achieves victory, it's over. And it's actually something which drives one into a state of boredom and eventually despair, for there is no way to actually cheat that systematic limitation on the aesthetic stage. One eventually reaches the second stage of ethics rather than aesthetics, in which one is no longer simply trying to feel pleasure for oneself, is instead committing one's action to the universal ideals of seeking the common good of the whole community rather than just the pseudo-good of a single self. This, however, is not sufficient either to provide a solution to the existential dilemma of having a life that will end in death at some point. So one can only move beyond that to the religious stage as such, in which one paradoxically goes from the universal intelligibility of ethics as the ethical code, after all, is something which all have to adopt regardless of who they are, to truths about religion which actually cannot be understood at all. And for that very reason, one cannot systematically build up to the truths of religion, such as the paradox that God is both omnipotent, or all-powerful, and omniscient, or all-good. In which case, if he's all-powerful, he's omniscient as all-knowing, and he's also all-good. Well, in this case, one cannot explain why evil exists, because if God is all-powerful, he'd be powerful enough to get rid of evil. If he was all good, he would be good enough to desire that there would be no suffering. And if he would be all-knowing, he would be able to know how to do that. Kierkegaard's response is that the absurdity of paradox is not a problem, for one is not working with a logical system in which one concept is connected with another, as we saw in the case of medieval philosophy, or in which one result is following from a procedure which would be the same for anyone who does it. In other words, technology. Rather, one can only be dealing with a leap of faith, which can only occur for the single individual. This is why he argued that being born into, say, the Church of Denmark, and then following the rituals which everybody else in that church does, such as attending the service on Sunday morning, or reading particular sections from the Bible, that's really not the religious stage, because the religious stage can only be a leap of faith carried out by the individual, rather than the entire crowd, the entire religious community, for whom truth cannot ever appear to all of them at once, but only individually. Kierkegaard compared this approach to that of Socrates in his philosophical fragments. As we recall, for Plato and Plato's Socrates at the very least, truth is actually something which is eternal, because it's always making reference in one way or another to the world of ideas. In that case, learning new information isn't really learning new information, it's simply recollecting things you didn't know that you know. In that case, the moment of recollection doesn't really matter, and the teacher who helped you solve a basic math problem in, say, 6th grade doesn't matter either. Any other teacher would have been just as good, and any other moment would have been the right moment to realize that 2 + 2 = 4, or whatever. Reason in the case of Socrates, is enough on its own to guarantee that the right result will follow logically from a given procedure, which basically anybody could use. Temporality is therefore totally irrelevant because the truth is eternally valid and not caught up in time. In contrast with this, Kierkegaard notes that if one is making a leap of faith to the religious stage, the moment is a moment of becoming, rather than the eternal validity of the being of the ideas. The teacher, who is Jesus, matters also because the truth is a paradox really about that teacher himself, rather than the teacher of a math problem who just helps you along the process. There also is no system that can guarantee that this will happen, because the subject is caught up in time, rather than stepping outside of it to contemplate something with an a priori validity. Likewise, Kierkegaard provided a religious meditation on the limitations of system, which is surprisingly in line with the critique provided by Nietzsche against, of all things, Christianity. Nietzsche's resistance to Christianity as, in his day anyway, the automatically given values of the crowd, which one could only go beyond through an act of having a stronger will than the crowd, can only really be understood through his metaphysical thesis that being qua being simply is the will to power. If we understand being to be that will, it really can only have two different forms. You can have the affirmative will to power, which says yes, despite all of the ugliness, suffering, and imperfection in the only world that there really is, if we lose any dualism with, say, the world of ideas in Plato, etc. Or you could have the will which is not strong enough to do that, in which case the will is negative. It says no, and rather than not will at all, for that is not even an option, it wills nothing. The stance of nihilism really is the projection of another world, another realm of being beyond this one, which I cannot accept because I'm not strong enough, in the form of, say, the world of ideas of Plato, or the thing in itself of Kant. I don't really experience the thing because it is beyond me, because, in a certain sense, it's superior to me. It's the standard of being there, which is greater than anything I have access to in this life. Or, of course, the afterlife in religion. You negate the ugliness of this world because you're promised a perfect world in the beyond. Nietzsche understood all of that to simply be the sign of a will which was not strong enough to pass, especially the ultimate test of the eternal return. If you lose the moment of creation, Nietzsche noted that time will become infinite because it had no beginning. But matter will remain finite, a formula in which the same things will inevitably repeat, not just once, but an infinite number of times. In this case, whether this is empirically true or not, the will is submitted to a test in which it will have to say yes to even the very worst moments of its life, the very ugliest forms of suffering which it had to personally endure in the past, will have to recur not only once, but an infinite number of times with no possibility of escape. For even if one could simply cease to be as a material being with no afterlife, even that would get you out of having to live with the consequences of an eternal return, which Nietzsche arrived at, ironically enough, through an even more radical form of materialism than the naive kind. At any rate, the question of whether the will is powerful enough to accept that is closely related to his understanding of truth in general. If being qua being is simply will to power, then you lose the theoretical and practical dimensions of truth as understood by, say, Kant, and all you're left with is the aesthetic. To review very briefly, for Kant, a theoretical truth, such as in natural science, is really just asking the question, is it real? If you're a paleontologist examining dinosaur bones, for example, it really does matter if those are really dinosaur bones. If they're counterfeits which were planted there as a practical joke, then that's really a problem, because you're doing science within the theoretical standpoint of truth. Similarly, within the practical standpoint, the question is, what should I do? If you have an ethical dilemma, such as you're on the street and you witness a robbery occur right in front of you, you have to do something. Even if that something is running away like a coward, you still have no choice except to act, because that is the stance of ethics. Well, for Nietzsche, in contrast with both of those, the only truth being aesthetic is really just another way of saying that the only question you can ask is it beautiful? If you see the paintings of Van Gogh, for example, you're not asking the question, is what I see right now real, as would be the case in theoretical science, nor even the ethical question, what should I do about this painting? You're simply asking the question, is this beautiful? And Nietzsche radicalized that to the point of universalizing that stance for all of experience. Really the only question, if you are living with the groundlessness of values in a world in which all is will to power, the only question you really can ask is whether it's beautiful. Ironically enough, the crowd, as I mentioned at the beginning of this segment, is something which Nietzsche rejected precisely because it was ugly, not just in a figurative sense, but in a literal sense, that the kind of values which anybody within the herd could democratically and automatically understand are literally ugly on aesthetic grounds alone. Something we find confirmed, quite frankly, in the kinds of music which can get 4 billion hits on YouTube, the kind of shows which can have multiple seasons on Netflix with everybody watching in lockdown, are actually the things which have failed the standard of aesthetic beauty despite supposedly being art. And for that very reason, Nietzsche argued that the greatness that you have within the kind of will to power which wills that which is aesthetically beautiful is not universally intelligible, as Kant argued. Kant claimed that great art is something which anyone with common sense will realize, that, say, the music of Mozart, the paintings of Van Gogh, the literature of Cervantes is great, despite the fact that, lacking any universal concept to say what it is explicitly, there actually is no logical grounds for proving that that art is good. It's simply an inborn faculty of common sense which all people have. In contrast with that Kantian view, Nietzsche argued that aesthetic greatness is not universally intelligible. It is accessible only to those who actually are great. In other words, those whose will has passed the test of having the strength to say yes, to affirm, despite the fact that the only world we have is one with an immense amount of suffering and ugliness. So we will finish this lecture on existentialist philosophy now, move on to the final lecture on phenomenology. Thank you.